Hello, my friends. The war in Ukraine is no longer defined by dramatic battlefield breakthroughs or sweeping political declarations. Instead, it has become a prolonged stress test of Western power, military, economic, financial, and institutional. And the results of that test are increasingly uncomfortable for Washington, Brussels, and their allies. What is unfolding is not a sudden collapse, but a steady exposure of structural weaknesses on one side and strategic patience on the other. Recent developments illustrate this dynamic with striking clarity. Attacks on maritime shipping in the Mediterranean, renewed attention on Russia's so-called shadow fleet, unresolved disputes over frozen Russian assets, and the gradual but persistent Russian advances across multiple fronts are not isolated phenomena. They are interconnected elements of a single strategic picture in which Russia is shaping the tempo, forcing reactions, and steadily narrowing Western options. This reality becomes particularly evident when examining the recent strikes on maritime targets in the Mediterranean. Ukrainian authorities, often with implicit Western backing, have claimed responsibility for drone attacks on vessels allegedly linked to Russia's shadow fleet. These actions have been framed as unprecedented, yet that framing is misleading. Earlier incidents, most notably the sinking of the Ursa Major, a ship transporting components for Russia's icebreaker fleet, followed a similar pattern. At the time, responsibility was obscured behind vague formulations of indirect involvement. Few executed, many enabled. What stands out is not merely the attacks themselves, but the narrative that followed. Western media outlets, citing anonymous Western and Ukrainian intelligence sources, suddenly began asserting that Russia's shadow fleet doubles as a floating intelligence network staffed by operatives from Russian services. These claims emerged only after the vessels began to be targeted. For years, the same ships were treated as civilian commercial assets. Only retroactively did they become legitimate military targets. And this timing is not incidental. It reflects a familiar information warfare technique. Redefine civilian infrastructure as hostile intelligence assets in order to justify escalation. Even if one assumes the presence of intelligence contractors aboard such vessels, they remain civilian manned ships operating in international waters. Targeting them erodes long-standing maritime norms and lowers the threshold for further escalation beyond the immediate theater of war. Months earlier, Russia's Foreign Intelligence Service warned that efforts were underway to manufacture a pretext for kinetic action against the shadow fleet. The events now unfolding align closely with that warning. This is not intelligence discovery. It is narrative construction. While maritime escalation plays out on the periphery, Europe is demonstrating a different but equally consequential vulnerability. Internal incoherence driven by ideological rigidity and economic self-harm. The reaction of European political elites to domestic unrest, particularly farmers' protests across multiple EU states, reveals a growing disconnect between governance and reality. Farmers do not abandon their land lightly. When they do, it signals deep structural failure. Yet instead of addressing these failures, segments of the European political class have responded by accusing farmers of undermining prosperity, fueling inflation, and even serving Russian interests. The reflex to attribute all internal dissent to Kremlin manipulation has become a substitute for policy. Ukraine, in this sense, has become a universal justification invoked to silence criticism, impose regulations, and deflect accountability. This is not strength. It is fragility masked by moral certainty. The irony is stark. Europe's regulatory regime has already pushed agriculture to the brink. Further cuts to support, justified under the banner of resisting pro-Russian influence, only deepen Europe's dependency on external food suppliers, many of them outside the EU and some directly adjacent to it. Strategic self-sabotage is no longer accidental. It is systemic. Nowhere is Europe's strategic confusion more visible than in the handling of frozen Russian assets. For months, Western leaders floated plans to seize or leverage roughly 210 billion in immobilized Russian funds to finance Ukraine. The proposal was presented as morally righteous and economically painless. It was neither. Belgium, which holds a significant portion of these assets, consistently opposed the plan, not out of sympathy for Russia, but out of concern for systemic financial risk. France and Italy eventually echoed similar reservations. The problem was never technical complexity, it was credibility. Sovereign assets are foundational to trust in the global financial system. Once they are politicized or confiscated, every country holding reserves in Western institutions receives the same message. Your assets are conditional. The plan collapsed predictably. In its place, the EU approved a €90 billion loan to Ukraine, backed by joint EU debt. Ukraine avoids interest payments for now, but European taxpayers do not. Crucially, the frozen Russian assets remain untouched, deferred to some future peace arrangement. The most powerful financial weapon Europe claimed to possess was placed back on the table, unused and diminished. From Moscow's perspective, this outcome represents a quiet victory. It exposes the lack of consensus within Europe, removes a major bargaining chip from immediate play, and signals that even at this stage, there are limits the EU is unwilling to cross. The same asymmetry is evident on the military front. The relocation of advanced missile systems, including intermediate-range ballistic platforms, toward Belarus has triggered predictable alarmist rhetoric from Kyiv and Western capitals. Yet the strategic significance of these movements is widely misunderstood. Whether such systems are stationed a few hundred kilometers closer to NATO borders is largely irrelevant. Modern ballistic and hypersonic weapons travel at speeds that render geographic proximity secondary. They cannot be intercepted by drones, and they cannot be reliably neutralized by existing defenses. Their function is not tactical shock, but strategic signaling. Russia is not rushing because it does not need to. These deployments reinforce escalation dominance and remind all parties that Moscow controls the ceiling of the conflict. Western responses remain cautious and incremental precisely because they are constrained by capabilities they cannot neutralize. Drones, meanwhile, tell a complementary story. The evolution of unmanned systems in Ukraine mirrors earlier revolutions in warfare, particularly World War I aviation. What began as reconnaissance quickly evolved into offensive capability. Early drones observed, then they dropped munitions. Then FPV drones became weapons in their own right. Now, experiments with air-to-air engagements and extended-range strike systems are emerging. Russia has adapted faster and more effectively in this domain, particularly through the widespread use of fiber-optic-controlled drones that are immune to electronic jamming. Footage showing vast stretches of terrain covered in discarded fiber-optic lines is not visual clutter, it is evidence of rapid technological adaptation under battlefield pressure. This is not desperation, it is institutional learning. On the ground, the operational picture reinforces the same conclusion. What Western commentators often label as stalemate is, in reality, a steady Russian advance punctuated by consolidation rather than retreat. In the south, strikes on bridges and transport nodes are shaping operations designed to isolate regions rather than seize them outright. Around Odessa, the objective is not immediate occupation, but control of access. Ports that cannot reliably move equipment or weapons become strategic liabilities over time. Elsewhere, long static fronts have begun to move. The sector around Sever, frozen for years, has seen rapid erosion of Ukrainian positions. Near Pokrovsk, Ukrainian units are increasingly squeezed into pockets, creating encirclements that receive little attention from those claiming unwavering support for Ukraine. Ignoring these developments does not protect Ukrainian soldiers. It abandons them. This leads to the central reality shaping the war's trajectory. The United States and NATO cannot simply stop. The conflict has been woven into the logic of Western power projection. It sustains NATO's relevance, justifies defense budgets, and reinforces narratives of U.S. leadership. Ending the war without a clear Russian defeat would expose the limits of that narrative and the political cost of such an admission is one Western institutions are structurally unable to absorb. Russia, by contrast, does not need to hurry. It entered the conflict expecting a long war and prepared accordingly. Sanctions did not collapse its economy. Industry adapted. Energy exports were rerouted. Defense production expanded. Militarily, Russia has shifted toward attritional dominance, favoring depth and sustainability over spectacle. Time works in Moscow's favor. Ukraine, tragically, has the least agency of all. Despite bearing the human cost, it does not set the strategic parameters of the war. Its options are constrained by external funding, foreign political cycles, and decisions made in distant capitals. Loans framed as solidarity will one day require repayment. Guarantees framed as commitments remain conditional. Ukraine fights bravely in a war whose trajectory it does not control. The conflict persists not because it must, but because no actor with decisive power is yet willing to accept the consequences of ending it. The West cannot stop without losing face. Russia does not need to rush to secure its objectives. Ukraine cannot force a resolution on its own terms. That is the cold reality beneath the noise. A strategic assessment of Russia's calculus in the Ukraine war and the West's self-inflicted weakness. The recurring question about Russia's newest strategic systems, particularly the Oreshnik, misses the core issue. The West continues to ask whether such weapons are intended primarily as deterrence or whether Russia actually plans to use them. That question assumes deterrence still functions in the traditional sense. It does not. Deterrence has already failed, not because Russia lacks capability, but because nothing Russia possesses has deterred the West from escalating tactical nuclear weapons, strategic nuclear weapons, advanced air and naval forces, large ground formations. None of this stopped NATO expansion, long-range strikes, or direct involvement. Adding another category of missiles, no matter how advanced, does not suddenly restore deterrence. Russia understands this. That is why the logic behind systems like the Oreshnik is not symbolic. The incentive is not to signal, but to accumulate. Russia's priority is production, stockpiling, and readiness, not rhetorical threat. The same logic applies to hypersonic systems, glide bombs, expanded range strike weapons, and air defense interceptors across the S-300, S-400, and S-500 families. The Russian approach is methodical: produce far more than is used and store it for contingencies that may never come, but must be planned for. This explains the tempo of Russia's operations in Ukraine. The so-called slow pace, often mocked in Western commentary, is not a sign of weakness or incapacity. It is a deliberate choice. Russia applies sustained pressure enough to prevent Ukraine from stabilizing or rebuilding, but avoids rapid breakthroughs that would prematurely escalate the conflict or trigger direct NATO intervention before Russian preparations are complete. This is not hesitation. It is strategic patience. During this extended period, Russia has been building stockpiles across every relevant category: missiles, artillery shells, glide bombs, armored vehicles, and air defense systems. The rate of production exceeds the rate of use. Even systems deployed sparingly, like the Oreshnik, are being produced in quantities far greater than public usage suggests. These weapons are not disappearing into the battlefield. They are being stored. Contrast this with the West. Western inventories are shrinking. Even with production increases since 2022, output still fails to match consumption. Stockpiles decline month after month. Wartime footing does not exist. Western militaries can launch strikes, conduct short bursts of high-intensity operations, and defend limited point targets, but they cannot sustain prolonged combat. This is not speculation. Public assessments acknowledge it. Britain could sustain high-intensity warfare for only weeks. The same applies across Europe and, quietly, to the United States as well. Russia, by contrast, is preparing for endurance. If a NATO-Russia conflict were to emerge, Russia could sustain high-level operations for an extended period using existing stockpiles, and then continue indefinitely due to higher production capacity. NATO would require a crash mobilization that would take years' time that would not exist in a real conflict. This asymmetry grows with each passing month. Russia becomes stronger. NATO weakens itself. Economic self-harm compounds, military depletion. Europe disconnects from Russian energy, raising costs across its economy. Massive financial commitments such as tens of billions pledged to Ukraine simply to keep the state functioning are made without clear sourcing, often through debt. Economic strain intensifies. Political legitimacy erodes. Governments grow unpopular. Yet the process continues. Russia, meanwhile, remains restrained. It has not mobilized millions, though it could. It has not launched large-scale breakthrough offensives along the 1,000-kilometer front, though weak points exist. Small formations maintain pressure. No major aero thrusts have been attempted since the post-2023 counteroffensive period. Militarily, breakthroughs would be costly initially but feasible. Russia chooses not to pursue them. This restraint reveals something critical. Russia is risk-averse, not reckless. Despite its advantage, it avoids actions that could provoke uncontrolled escalation. It preserves options rather than expending them prematurely. Western behavior, by contrast, assumes words and actions carry no consequences. That assumption is false. Direct attacks on Russia's nuclear deterrent infrastructure, involvement in operations inside Russian territory, and strikes on civilian shipping represent qualitative escalation. Russia has noticed deterrence, as traditionally conceived, no longer restrains the West, but Russian restraint still exists. That is not weakness. It is calculation. However, restraint has limits. Odessa now stands at the center of this calculus. Attacks on civilian vessels, particularly the so-called shadow fleet, cross thresholds that were previously avoided. Russian commentary, both official and unofficial, reflects growing anger. From a strategic standpoint, Odessa is the most logical target for retaliation and escalation. It is Ukraine's primary Black Sea port, a logistical hub, and a geopolitical prize sought by Western powers. If the four-oblast settlement framework collapses, Russian discussions increasingly reference additional objectives, including Odessa and Kharkiv. Recent strikes on bridges, rail lines, logistics centers, ports, industrial facilities, and energy infrastructure in the Odessa region are not random. They degrade Ukraine's rear area mobility and complicate force concentration. Whether this precedes a major offensive or serves as strategic pressure remains uncertain, but the preparation is evident. If Russia moves decisively toward Odessa, European panic is likely. Western leaders have repeatedly declared that Ukraine's defeat means Europe is next. These statements are not abstract. Military units are being repositioned, brigades are moving into the Baltics, shared security agreements multiply, war rhetoric becomes explicit. When senior officials speak openly of generational conflict and sacrifice, those words generate consequences. Russia hears them. If escalation accelerates, Russia will not initiate recklessly, but it will respond decisively. Any Western intervention risks triggering outcomes Europe is unprepared for. Russia's advanced strike systems face minimal effective air defense. Western industrial facilities remain centralized, visible, and vulnerable, many still structured around Cold War assumptions that no longer apply. A concentrated strike campaign could cripple Western military production in hours. Such a scenario would introduce immense nuclear risk. If a non-nuclear state like Germany suffered decisive losses, pressure on nuclear-armed allies would intensify. Russia understands this dynamic and seeks to avoid it, but cannot ignore it. Despite everything, there remains a narrow path to a negotiated settlement. Russia's continued restraint, despite its power advantage, suggests willingness to negotiate from strength. The outcome would be ugly and unsatisfying, but far preferable to catastrophe. The tragedy is that the West appears determined to exhaust itself militarily, economically, and politically before acknowledging reality. The belief that wars occur elsewhere, that costs can always be absorbed, and that language has no consequences, has expired. The unipolar moment is over. Strategic gravity has returned. If escalation continues, everyone loses: Russia, Ukraine, Europe, and the broader international system. Even a purely conventional conflict would be devastating. The fact that Russia still chooses restraint is the only reason catastrophe has not already occurred. That window is closing. In the end, what we are witnessing is not the unraveling of Russia, but the slow exposure of a Western illusion that has survived far longer than it deserved. The illusion that power can be exercised without consequence. The illusion that words are cost-free. The illusion that escalation is something you can manage from a distance, like a spreadsheet or a press release. That illusion is now colliding with reality. Russia has made its position unmistakably clear, not through hysteria or theatrical threats, but through behavior. It has fought this war at a pace chosen, not imposed. It has absorbed provocation without reflexive overreaction. It has built, produced, stored, and prepared, while its adversaries depleted themselves. This is not the conduct of a desperate state. It is the conduct of a state that believes time is working in its favor, and so far, it has been right. The West, meanwhile, has mistaken restraint for weakness and patience for fear. It has escalated rhetorically while hollowing itself out materially. It has promised victory without the means to sustain war. It has dismantled its own energy security, drained its arsenals, destabilized its politics, and told its populations that sacrifice is inevitable without ever explaining why this sacrifice is necessary or what end state justifies it. Ukraine, tragically, has never been the decision maker in this conflict. Its role has been instrumental, not sovereign. Its territory has become the arena where strategic fantasies collide with industrial and demographic realities. And now, as the costs compound and options narrow, the very states that claimed Ukraine must fight to the end quietly prepare themselves for a future in which they may have to live with the consequences of having pushed too far. Russia does not need to rush. It does not need to gamble. It does not need to prove anything. Every month that passes strengthens its relative position and weakens that of its opponents. If negotiations come, they will come on Russian terms, not because Russia demands them, but because there will be no alternative left that does not involve unacceptable risk. And that is the most dangerous part of this moment. Not that Russia seeks escalation, but that Western leaders seem incapable of recognizing limits. They speak openly of war while assuming someone else will pay the price. They invoke deterrence while eroding the very foundations that once made deterrence credible. They insist there are no consequences right up until consequences arrive. History is unforgiving to those who confuse narrative with power. It is even harsher to those who ignore reality when reality is still offering them a way out. Russia understands this. That is why it has not exhausted its options. That is why it has not revealed its full hand. And that is why, if this conflict expands beyond Ukraine, it will not do so on terms chosen in Brussels, London, or Washington. The final irony is this. The one actor consistently behaving as though a wider war would be catastrophic is the very actor accused daily of seeking one. If catastrophe comes, it will not be because Russia failed to signal restraint, but because the West refused to hear it. Time is still available. Space for de-escalation still exists. But neither time nor space is infinite. The longer this lesson is ignored, the harsher it will be when finally learned.